we are going into this interview. So my first question to you would be that since you are one of the, earliest member or one of the vital members of WGGE, can you take us through the journey of WGGE and your journey with this organization?
Okay. So I think it started with mostly a discussion among friends. That was very early. There were certain developments. For example, it was slowly beginning to happen that we were having formal meetings to discuss the inequity question in astrophysics. That happened around 2008. A major trigger was the International Year of Astronomy in 2009, which celebrated 400 years of Galileo's discoveries. And one of the flagship programs of that year was called She's an Astronomer.
Right.
And although some people sort of somewhat misinterpreted it to mean, showcasing women astronomers, but actually it was meant to look at why there is underrepresentation of women in astrophysics worldwide. So those discussions were happening. There was one at IIA and so on. Gradually, this discussion among friends crystallized the idea of having a session in the Astronomical Society of India meeting itself to discuss the inequity question. So I think there was one informal kind of discussion in 2010 or so where I wasn't there. But in the meeting that happened in 2013, which was in IISA Mohali, we decided to actually ask for a scheduled formal session. So Preeti Kharb, Rashmi Lakshmi, and several others worked a lot to organize this, and it was a plenary, as in it was a session that was not in conflict with any other. And there was also in the meeting venue, there was something called a gender corner where they had some sort of posters and that sort of thing. So this session was a very successful one in the sense that it didn't conflict. It was a packed auditorium. And I too gave a talk there. There were several talks. And I actually got a lot of positive comments about my introducing, the idea that gender is a social construct and that sort of thing. And particularly heartening for me was that when I spoke about how interventions to mitigate inequity should not perpetuate the societal patriarchy, and I gave the example of governmental child care leave, which was only available to women at the time, and it was somewhat new, so not too many people knew about it, and it was very heartening that a few young men colleagues were furious when they discovered that this was only open to women, and they thought it was not right. And I thought that was a very good sign, and so there could be real change. So then the path was a bit rocky after that, but nevertheless, gradually a group was formalized. Despite our requests and despite the success at IISA Mohali, in subsequent meetings, the gender equity session would be scheduled, parallel with another session, so splitting the audience and all that sort of thing happened. But anyway, it has come to stay, more or less. And Preeti Kharb did an extraordinary job leading the effort with a lot of solid support from younger colleagues who were in the working group and also many others, but mainly both women and men. And she managed to have a lot of introduce a lot of measures, concrete measures. So for example, child care being almost mandatory in ASI meetings, that was one positive impact that came out. It really needs to be included in the list of requirements that ASI has when they call for bids to host meetings, but I'm hoping that will happen. And the other very concrete thing that happened was the Annamani lecture series, which is primarily about bringing practitioners from other disciplines to discuss their take on why there is inequity within the sciences. And that has also become a very important resource because they are all recorded and online, and we've had some extremely good speakers in that. So so I mean, I'm no longer in the working group, but I'm hoping that they will have many more impactful achievements.
Right. And I'm sure it will definitely make a very positive change into our working environment. But you have been an astrophysicist for nearly 4 decades now, if I'm not wrong. So were there many female role models that you had when you were growing up, or your inspirations in this field? Like how did you decided to be like astrophysicist?
So my deciding to do astrophysics and become an astrophysicist, I think it was a sort of combination of both what happened naturally during my childhood and also some serendipity. So I was growing up. I grew up half a century ago, and it was a very different ethos. It was an ethos where the advancement of science and the hope that science was the path to prosperity and abundance. It was a very strong ethos at that time. And Sputnik had just been launched a year before I was born, and humans went into space when I was a very small child. So in fact, Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova, they were my childhood heroes. And we learned about the moon landings. All of this was very thick in the air. We would listen to radio broadcasts live of some of these happenings and all of that. So my interest in science per se was kind of nothing extraordinary. I thought it was rather natural and quite ordinary. And my parents would often, spread a mat in the garden, and after dinner we would watch the sky. And even though I grew up in a town, those days we could still see the sky. So I could see, so I saw the stars, planets, meteors, artificial satellites, and even the Milky Way. And once, most excitingly, there was a comet when I was a few years old. So I always thought of sky watching as something of a hobby. But then later was the serendipity, in the sense that when I did physics and all that, and because of my interest in science. But later, when I joined TIFR for a PhD, I kind of discovered that one could use solid physics to understand, phenomena in the cosmos, and that could become a vocation. So then I sort of ditched my idea of doing nuclear physics and decided to do astrophysics for a PhD. So that shift from hobby to kind of a core interest happened, I would say, serendipitously, because I joined TIFR where they had an astrophysics group, and that's how it happened. So role models are hard to pinpoint for me. There have been many role models, but I would say, when I was a young child, Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova, and later on Marie Curie and Irina Curie, and I would say during my student days, I would say Annamani during my PhD days. Because she was around here in Bangalore as a emeritus scientist, and I didn't have direct interactions with her, but she was just around a lot, and she was a real inspiration, I have to say.
Definitely. And I'm sure you are now in many people's list as an inspiration for them to be an astrophysicist. I know personally few people who are inspired by you very much.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, it's true. But I'm pretty sure that your journey throughout, like not only in astrophysics, but you have taken like a lot of stand for gender equity in scientific community in as a whole. So I'm sure this was not an easy journey. Like we are still, like in my generation also, is still facing a lot of challenges in this area, and yours was like still a lot of challenges. You have solved so many for us, but I think like what were your challenges throughout this journey with WGGE, of course?
I would say the main challenge, so actually, I should say that I was in the WGGE, but later on, I wrote a proposal to the Indian Physics Association to form a working group in physics as well.
Right.
And there in the WGGE, I was part of it, but I was not leading the effort. It was the younger people.
Yes.
Whereas here, I was leading the effort. Right. So my sort of work had been in parallel in both things, and also in the international working group of the IUPAP, the International Union for Pure and Applied Physics. Right. So my experience is kind of a combination of all of these. I would say the main challenge is the lack of acknowledgement among the scientists that there is inequity. So even today, they accept disparity. They accept that there is gender disparity in science, but not that there is inequity or discrimination in science. Right. And this lack of acknowledgement, of course, is among both men and women. So it is not limited to men. And the other thing is that even among people who are gender champions, gender equity champions within science, again, both women and men, I found it a challenge that they do not see the importance of drawing upon the huge scholarship that there is in sociology, in history, in philosophy on the gender inequity question. Right. And they also refuse to draw upon the very, very advanced Indian feminist movement. And I think this is because our training is very narrow. As physicists, our training is very narrow. So we don't, and also in our society, we look down upon the social sciences and so on. So that makes us ignore these things to our peril, actually. So as a result, what happens is that even though they recognize the gender gap, we land up prescribing very patriarchal interventions to address the inequity problem. Things like more maternity leave, science camps for girls, flexible hours for women. Now there is a mobility scheme only for women. All of these reflect that patriarchal mindset. Right. So that was the second challenge, I would say. And the third challenge I faced, at least, was that equality work is seen very negatively within the profession. And so they value your scientific work less if you also work for equality. And that is shifting now a little bit, especially because there's a lot of pressure from the international scene. Right. So that is shifting, but not necessarily in a good way. I mean, now it is becoming like being a gender champion can become a path of career growth, which is not necessarily, a good thing for the cause. But in my time, it was a big challenge that it was looked down upon. Equality work was looked down upon. So, that was a problem.
Right. So you mentioned that there are like social sciences and our scientific community have not had many, collaborations or let's say communication in between these two topics. So how do you propose that these two subjects can come together, or do something together to address this issue?
So, I mean, one good example for me was the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, when they realized that they have to do something about gender inequity. They constituted a working group. This was about 2000, the year 2000, to deal with this. I was not involved at the time. And the mandate of the working group was to organize conferences every 3 years, international conferences, which would bring people from all countries, physicists from all countries together to deliberate on this issue and how different cultures, how the problem manifests in different cultures, and what ideas can come together and what people can take back. And all of this, and the social insights from the social sciences was an important component of these conferences.
Right.
So I got involved in these conferences after the third or the fourth one in 2011. And there, of course, by then I had also realized that, gender inequity is a sociological problem. So we have to have insights from the social sciences. So when I had organized She's an Astronomer programs in my institute and all that, I had social scientists participating in it. In fact, our first discussion was chaired by, our first and second discussion was chaired by social scientists and so on. And I already saw the value in how they came to it. In fact, I remember at this She's an Astronomer discussion that we had, it was chaired by a social scientist from Bengaluru called Geeta Sen. And she put it very nicely. She said, it's all about intonation. So she said, it used to be that you would say, she's an astronomer? Really? Seriously? And then at that time, we were in this stage of, oh, wow, she's an astronomer. How amazing. And what we need to get to is a stage where you just say, oh, she's an astronomer.
Yeah, like generally.
Like nothing great about it. She's just a regular son. So she put it really well. And this was back in 2008. So, these social scientists had a lot of input to bring in to the dialogue. And so then when I went to the international conferences, that was emphasized. So that was why we wrote a proposal. I submitted a proposal to the Indian Physics Association in 2016. So the thing was, what I found when I participated in this conference in 2011 and then again in 2014, that every other country had a national forum where they could take back the discussion from the international conferences and deliberate upon them there. And, use those recommendations or modify them or whatever in order to implement them in their own communities. Whereas in India, we didn't have anything like that. So I proposed... I submitted a proposal. A lot of senior physicists supported this. I submitted a proposal to the Indian Physics Association in 2016, on Women's Day in 2016, saying that they should constitute a working group under the Indian Physics Association. So meanwhile, the WGGE had already been constituted and they were already having activities and all that, and clearly having an impact. So the Indian Physics Association approved launch of this working group 1 year later. And one of the highlights of the early activities was an first of its kind national conference, which was along the lines of the international conference. So we had about 200 physicists and 40 people from other disciplines like sociology, education, and so on, all come together at this conference. And all the physics invited talks were presented by women. physicists. And then the other talks, the non-physics talks on inequity and on what has been done in a couple of other countries and what has been done across the country. These things were discussed by both, presented by both men and women. And this conference happened in the University of Hyderabad. And there were many reasons for us to choose that, but one big reason was this physicist called Bindu Bamba, who was a faculty there, and she was dean at that time. And she was very enthusiastic about hosting this conference. And her own history was that she was the only physicist who was a founder member of the Women's Studies department in her university. So, you know, in India, in around the 80s or so, there were many universities which constituted women's studies departments, which deliberated on the gender inequity question. And not too many scientists and certainly no physicists were involved in that. And Bindu was an exception. So that was one big reason. So we had this conference in the University of Hyderabad. So there was a very strong participation by social scientists and educationists and so on. And we also had workshops there to make people understand, I mean, how can we as physicists understand inequity and how it plays out, how it is a systemic problem. For that, we even had workshops that used theater methodologies, for example.
So was Hyderabad Charter did it started in this meeting or was it later on conceived?
No, so it started much earlier. So I had, the moment this working group got launched, I had started drafting something like a charter, and I was inspired by something called the Baltimore Charter, which came about in 1991 or so in the US. It was by the American Astronomical Society. And it was for me as a postdoc then an eye-opener to show me how this was very much a systemic and structural problem within the profession. So that charter was an eye-opener for me and very inspiring. And I had seen it function over the years, and it was fairly effective. And I'd seen how they had managed to get buy-in from the community and so on. And so that was the reason I had thought of doing something similar. And so when we launched the working group, I'd started drafting something like this. And people here hadn't heard of the Baltimore Charter because, it was only in the astrophysics discipline and in the US. But when they learned about it, they were also very inspired. And so we drafted this and presented it at the conference and got a lot of input. And it was discussed a lot in the conference. And Bindu Bamba played a major role in that. Shrubhabati Goswami had several important inputs into the charter. And we discussed it with the whole assembly and drew upon those discussions. And so it was finalized at that conference. So that's why we called it the Hyderabad Charter.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the Hyderabad, like what it consists of, just to give a brief idea about this charter?
Yeah. So this charter has some very obvious things. So there are some fundamental principles, things like people of all gender have equal potential to excel, and utilizing everybody's talent is important for the enterprise and so on. And then it has a whole bunch of guiding principles and a whole bunch of recommendations. So the guiding principles, some examples of the guiding principles is, for instance, we say in it that closing the quantitative gender gap at all levels of our practice is a necessary step to achieve equality, but it's not sufficient.
Right.
So even if you have achieved closing of the gender gap in terms of numbers, that doesn't mean it's a healthy climate. So but it is a necessary step. And if there is a gap, it means that there's something wrong. We also say that the practice of physics is a social activity, and so addressing the gender bias requires insights from the social sciences. We also say that interventions and strategies must be such that they do not endorse societal patriarchy. So I think this is very important, because all the interventions in the past have been towards, flowing from a patriarchal mindset. Like I said, some of the interventions like flexible work hours or science camps for girls, these are all, and there are even training schools for women scientists to enhance their skills. So these are, again, along the lines of fixing the women.
Right.
But actually, there's nothing wrong with the women.
Yeah.
The women are being pushed back. So, we need to stop pushing people back on the basis of gender.
Right.
So that is the main thrust of the Hyderabad Charter. So there are several recommendations for different situations, like classroom, hiring in institutions, and one of the big things we recommend is that gender inequality education is required for everybody. And particularly for the gatekeepers, so leaders of institutions, editorial chief editors of journals, and scientific conference chairs. For leadership, it is really important, and it should be done for both men and women. Because the underlying idea is that we are all, regardless of our gender, we are all brought up to accept sexist thought, sexist action. So we are all vulnerable to gender bias.
Right.
And so gender equality education should be for everybody.
Right.
So these are some of the sort of key things. One important recommendation we make for institutions is that when hiring, there should not be any hidden norms.
Right.
So the process of hiring should be drafted before starting the process as to what are your criteria, how are you going to make the selection, where are you going to advertise, etc. should be arrived at before the process begins. And there shouldn't be hidden norms, because there are women who are meritorious but are disqualified just because they have a spouse in that department, or just because it is assumed that they will not join that department because their boyfriend is in some other city, for instance. So these things are still happening even today. And so that's why we say that there can't be any hidden norms.
Right.
Whatever you say in the advertisement, those are the criteria by which you should hire.
Right.
So these are some salient features, I would say, of the charter.
Right. And so what do you think that not only astronomy institutions, but in general, that the educational institutions that we have throughout the country, so what can they do now at this point of time to address this issue, or any particular notes that they should keep in mind in terms of addressing this issue?
So institutions need to do things at a whole lot of levels. Firstly, they have to examine all their procedures to see whether they are equitable or not. So for instance, it's not necessarily that there's a procedure which is blatantly related to gender, but it might effectively be related to gender. For example, some institutions have an age cutoff for application. Right, an age cutoff is, so one's age is not related to one's merit.
Correct.
So they should simply look at merit and not at age. And if you dig into it, you realize that having an age cutoff impacts women much worse than it impacts men.
True.
But it's not a good thing regardless, because it's not a merit-based
Right.
criteria.
Right.
So there are things like this. So they need to examine all their procedures and make sure that there is no patriarchy and gender bias creeping in to their procedures. For example, a teaching institution should not segregate their classrooms by gender. The students should be, seated or do lab work or do other activities in a gender mixed fashion.
Right.
There are some institutions where they will list on the website their women staff members by their marital status.
Right.
But not the men. So that is not a nice thing. There are institutions where if they want to felicitate honored guests, they will ask the young women to dress up and offer flowers. That's again, sexist is what I would say. Mentoring is one major thing. Right. So I have known a lot of even my own colleagues over the decades, mentor young women differently from young men. Right. I think that is not right. So young men will be told that they need to stick to their passion and follow their interest and this and that, and young women will be told, but you need to work very hard because you have to manage your family. I have never heard a young man being told that he has to work very hard in order to manage a family. Right. So these kind of things are not good. It is another very common thing that happens is that young women are told, this subject is not suited to you. This discipline or this sub-discipline is not suited to you, or this sub-discipline is better because then you can manage your family also. I've even heard things like computational astrophysics is a good option because you can start your program and it will run for a couple of hours and then you can go take care of all your so there's no limit to this, and they're all based on this patriarchal notion. So that needs to stop. So institutions need to be really mindful that they're not doing these things. And outreach is another very important thing where this bias can play out. So it is important for people who organize outreach activities, especially science outreach activities, to first of all make sure that participation is diverse and do whatever it takes to ensure that diversity. So if people are worried about traveling large distances or whatever, then provide transport for everybody, not necessarily for the girls, but address those logistical difficulties so that there is equal participation or diverse participation. And science should be projected as being done by everyone. That it was done by everyone and it can be done by everyone and it is being done by everyone. So it is really important to not have talks only by men scientists, but have gender diverse talks, set of speakers in materials, both people of all backgrounds should be projected as doing science. You have these sort of diagrams of people doing work in the lab. You have pictures and photographs. All of these, there's a need to be very mindful of all of that. Or even writing articles. There should be articles by people of all backgrounds on science.
Right. So like you mentioned, the program She's an Astronomer, that can be taken up again by many institutions. So that is like WGGs, I think, have done a lot of work since its conception and have reached a lot of milestones till now. But I think we are nearing the end of this interview, but I'm sure there are a lot of things that people have now realized after watching this interview, like what is WGGE, what they are doing, what is your role in all of this, and there is a gender equity issue in the community, not only in astronomy, I would say, but in general in scientific community. But then I would want to ask you, like, what would be the future roadmap for the WGG? Like, it has reached a lot of milestones, but what is next? What is coming?
Yeah, so I think the future roadmap should be charted by the existing WGGE, and I'm sure they'll do an excellent job. They have very solid ground on which to build upon. I think it would be good if they build upon some of the studies that have happened. For example, as part of the International Conference on Women in Physics, we have written country status reports where we have shown that the idea that girls are not interested in science is not substantiated by the data. We have shown data, especially from the Inspires Fellowship statistics, and also there's a very interesting study of high school students which was published in Current Science in 2018, that there is no, the bigger problem is that boys are being socialized to think that girls can't do science well. So if we at all we have science camps or schools or this sort of thing, they should be for all genders, and they should dismantle this idea that science can only be done by an exclusive group of people. Even the ASI survey, so that's one of the big milestones of the WGG is this survey that they've been doing. We started this actually in Mohali, I think, in 2013. I don't remember exactly. And one of the things is that there's a very large fraction of people who responded to the survey who reported seeing discrimination, gender discrimination. However, when asked what should be addressed, they did not say address the gender discrimination. They talked about childcare at conferences. So, why is there this disconnect? The questions like this are what we need to ask going forward, I think. But I'm sure the current WGG will do a wonderful job.
Yes. So since this interview is airing on, Women's Day, do you have any special message for not only for women, let's be gender equal, for everyone who wants to do astronomy or astrophysics, and something that you would like to share with them?
So for people who want to do astrophysics I would say that firstly, astrophysics is for everybody. Even if you do not become a scientist, astrophysics is something that everybody should engage with, because it has something important to tell us about how as human beings we view ourselves and our place in the universe and so on. And so I think that it is a good thing if all young people have some engagement with astrophysics, either through outreach programs or star parties or even internships working in a lab. Even though they might not intend to do astrophysics as a career. For people who want to do astrophysics as a career, I would say choose an institution, a college, or a university which has good teachers and good laboratories, not necessarily high university rank, but good teachers and good laboratories and a nurturing environment, not too competitive an environment of study, because I think that is what has the most impact on future. And And again, I mean, even at the college level, I would say that if you choose astrophysics as your main subject interest, it would still be good to be exposed to a variety of disciplines and subjects, because it is, I think, important to learn to understand how our world works, not just the material world, but the whole world. So I would say that as well. And as far as Women's Day is concerned, I would say, equality is everyone's work. Yeah. Basically, it is not just the work of the women, it is everyone's work. So everyone needs to participate, everyone needs to contribute, everyone needs to acknowledge that if we address the inequity problem, it becomes a productive and nice working environment for everybody. Right. So if there is inequity, that makes it a not healthy environment for everybody. So that realization, I hope, will come.
Yes, so we have throughout the interview, we have talked a lot about gender equality and your work at WGGE and everyone. But I'm pretty sure I am very interested in knowing your research, and I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of audience that would be interested in knowing your career in astrophysics. So if you can tell us in short about your research, about your work in astrophysics.
Okay, so I've worked on the same things right from my PhD days, which is these very big black holes that are found in the centers of galaxies. And because they are black holes and they have this very strong gravitational field, any matter that comes close to them will be drawn into them and accelerated heavily and heated before that matter plunges into the black hole. Right. So in the process of this acceleration and heating, they shine, that material shines. Right. So even though a black hole is black or dark, when this sort of phenomenon occurs, that whole system shines and shines very powerfully, more powerful than the light from all the stars of that galaxy put together. Wow. And so we are able to see these black holes systems out to very, very large distances. Right. And so we are able to not only understand their own physics, but they also become beacons in the cosmos to understand how our cosmos evolved across the ages. So essentially, that's what I do. So I look at these objects at multiple frequencies, which means I use radio telescopes. That was mainly, I mean, in my PhD, I mainly used radio telescopes and a little bit optical telescopes. But later I've used also X-ray telescopes and ultraviolet telescopes and so on. And so I use my telescopes to observe how these objects behave, to try and understand what drives them and also what impact they have on their environment and their sort of galaxy, because there are indications that the physical processes around these very, very compact, relatively speaking, small black holes in the center of the galaxy, which is vast, does influence things that happen in the galaxy. Yes. So that is sort of what I study.
Wow, that is super inspiring. And I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of things that were eye-opener for me, and I'm very sure that it would be the same for the audience. But due to short of time, we have to now conclude this amazing interview. But I'm very sure that we'll keep meeting and we'll keep working on this together. I'm thankful to you for joining us, and very, I really appreciate for you giving us your time. So thank you so much.